So I wasn't sure if I was going to get introductory remarks or just take those three questions. So I'll take those three questions, and then it sounds like we'll do Q&A. And I know we don't have much time, so I really want to get to your questions as fast as we can. Quite a tremendous turnout on a lovely day. I almost didn't come because I haven't seen so much sun recently. So I'm going to take that as a sign that there's still interest in this town about U.S.-Russian relations. I'll be quite blunt. The main reason I'm here today is to talk about PNTR and Jackson Vanik. I was here a while ago now when you had a very, in my opinion, a very important meeting here to discuss these things. That was before Russia had agreed to join the WTO and before the accession agreement was done. I remember very vividly standing up here and saying, we're going to get it done, and we're going to get it done this year. And I heard lots of people in the lunchtime saying, you know, you naive people, you come and go, but, you know, that we've been doing this for 20 years and it's not going to get done. Well, we got it done. And we think it's a great deal, by the way, for the American economy, for American businesses, for American farmers, for American workers. We think it's a great deal, and maybe we'll spend a little time talking about it, because I think there's a misperception that somehow Russia joining the WTO is a gift to Russia. And there's an incredible misperception that lifting Jackson Vanik, or to be more accurate, terminating the application of Jackson Vanik to Russia, is a gift to Russia. It's nothing of the kind. WTO accession is good for us. That's why we argued and fought so hard to get the deal we did. And lifting Jackson Vanik is only a gift to our farmers, our industry, and our workers. It's no gift to Russia at this point. It may have been before in a different scenario where some people had argued we should lift Jackson Vanik first and then do WTO, but we're in a different world now. So to me, that's why I came here, and I hope that we can have some discussion of that. I jumped to your second question before your first. Let me say two words about the first and then briefly on the next two, and then let's get to questions. In terms of what the election in Russia and the period we're in means for the reset, I want to start just very cryptically, or I was going to say tweeting like, that is 140 characters like, as opposed to my usual 50 minutes that I get for a lecture at Stanford. And just to remind you of what the reset and the theory behind the policy was all about. And remind you where we were at policy. It was a tough time in U.S.-Russian relations for obvious reasons. When the president first met President Medvedev in London in April 2009, he used a phrase that there's been a dangerous drift in U.S.-Russian relations, and it's time to end that drift. And the reason he wanted to end the drift was not to have better relations with Russia, not to have happier relations, not to, the kind of mood stuff. It was rather, as he looked out at the problems that we were addressing as we came into office, I think of Afghanistan, I think of Iran, I think of the START treaty ending, I think of North Korea, I think of the WTO. We looked at those issues, and the view was, why is this not in our mutual interest? And we gave him a bunch of explanations for why we hadn't reached agreement on a whole set of those issues. And his idea was with more engagement of the government, first, at the highest level, including him personally, and second, across the government. And that's why we created the Bilateral Presidential Commission. We would have a better chance of realizing win-win outcomes, as the president used that phrase, than if we were just kind of, every now and again communicating with them. So that was the first idea. The engagement is a means to this end, not the other way around. Second part of the reset, very important, was that as we engaged with the Russian government, we were going to try to increase engagement with Russian society in parallel to that. And by that we meant both engagement of Russian government, American government officials with civil society, as we practiced from the very beginning, and including when President Obama was in Moscow, as well as trying to create more connectivity between our civil society and Russian civil society. We call this dual track engagement. We do both these things at the same time. And third, we rejected, I would say, in large measure, approaches from the Russian government, but maybe from our side too. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. But we rejected the concept of linkage. We rejected the idea that in order to get a START treaty, we're going to not cooperate with our partners in Georgia. We rejected the idea that in order to get the sanctions on Iran, 1929, the most comprehensive sanctions that have ever been passed through the UN Security Council. We rejected the notion that in order to do that, we're going to check our values at the door, and we're not going to talk about human rights abuses or the problems that we see in Russia. And that's the reset in 5 minutes or less. And our view of the reset so far is that it's achieved real results that are good for our national security, that are good for our economy, and are we're proud of those achievements. The the Northern Distribution Network, which was just a tiny fraction of how we supplied our troops in Afghanistan in 2009, is now well over 50% of the way we supply our troops, and that number keeps going up, not down. That's a good thing for American national interest. The New START Treaty, that's a good thing to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, and most importantly, from our point of view, to continue to have the inspections, the transparency that goes with that. That helps to keep us in a stable relationship vis-a-vis Russia when it comes to our nuclear arsenals. Third, Iran, as I just mentioned. We started in a very creative way, in a cooperative way, to make offers to Iran about a way out of this impasse. And us, together with the Russians and the French, did some very creative things to try to change that dynamic. Tehran rejected us. We didn't reject the overture. We put together a creative overture, the Tehran Research Reactor deal. They rejected us, and after that rejection, by the way, they rejected Russia as well as the United States. And therefore, we then cooperated with Russia to, again, as I mentioned, to pass UN Security Council Resolution 1929. Russia then, after that, canceled the S-300 contract and literally sent tens of millions of dollars back to Iran, which had been paid as a down payment for that military system. The 1-2-3 agreement, North Korea, WTO, less tension between Russia and its neighbors. I know that's controversial, but I would say if you look at where we were in the beginning of the administration and where we are now, I think there's less tension across the board. To what extent we had anything to do with that is more complicated, but we've been involved in that, whether it's about with Georgia or the Baltic states or other countries in Europe. We've been engaged with the Russians on that. And then, if I had more time, but I'll just point you to our website. Every day we're doing things that we think are good for our national interests with Russia. Whether it's a new visa, the nuclear security summit that's coming up in Seoul, terrorism, the business deals that have been done. Trade is at the highest levels it's ever been at. Last year should be a lot more, and we're going to get to that when we get to the second question. The Fort Ross deal that we were just talking about. Fantastic cooperation between private sector, Russian private sector, and the California government to restore an important place, an important park at Fort Ross in California. Skolkovo, MIT. In other words, there's just a lot more going on as a result, I think, of this strategy that we've done. Now, the challenges are real, and I don't want to dismiss them. Syria, we have a fundamental disagreement. We've been working this for a long time. We're still not closer. The alternative, and I would mention missile defense is another one, and I would mention disagreements about the pace of political change in Russia. Those are three big issues today that are front and center in terms of challenges in U.S.-Russian relations. But what we would argue is the way to deal with all three of those is not disengagement or a return to containment or somehow a pivot away from our general strategy. We would say that even on tough issues like Syria, better to engage, try to find common space, even if it means we have to adjust. That's exactly what Secretary Clinton was doing with Foreign Minister Lavrov today in New York. And I should remind you, not let our policy vis-a-vis Syria or other places be defined solely in terms of what we're doing cooperatively with Russia. I think that's a big misconception I hear sometimes, that, if we don't get a Security Council resolution on Syria, then we're not doing anything else. And that's just not true. We have a very comprehensive policy vis-a-vis Syria, of which one of the areas that we're working with is to have cooperation of the international community at the UN Security Council and elsewhere. Second, on PNTR, I've already made it clear, I don't want to go into that, but to me, at this stage, to quote Senator Baucus, this is a no-brainer. The economic interests are obvious. You all should read the draft report, or soon to be released again. Senator Baucus has read it, so I hope the rest of you have. I won't go into the arguments here in the interest of time. My colleagues from USTR brought a bunch of fact sheets that are outside, laying there, that show you the arguments for why this is good for the American economy. Pick them up there or go to their website if they run out. I think the argument is just simply overwhelming on the economic side. And don't forget the negative consequences of holding on to Jackson Vanik. Because if we do that, we will be a non-application. We'll be the ones on the outside with everybody else within the WTO adhering to the WTO rules. And the Russian government has made it very clear to us that they're not going to give us some special privileges just because we haven't worked out our Jackson Vanik legislation. I know many hope for that, right? Well, we'll still get the TRQs for pork. No, we won't. We'll still get the lower tariffs because the Russians like us so much because of what we did to get them into the WTO. No. We pulled them in to do a lot of those things. That was a very difficult set of negotiations. So there are some forces in Russia, not all, but there are some that would be really delighted to see those markets go to other countries. So to me, this is just on the economics, a straight up no-brainer. Now, others argue, well, we need this for democracy and human rights. That's an argument out there. I was over on Capitol Hill earlier this morning. Our answer to that is the following. We're not going to have an argument about the diagnostics with anybody on the Hill. We're not going to claim Russia's more democratic than you think. We're not going to get into that kind of argument. We'll just agree. Russia has problems with these issues. Where we disagree is with the prescription. We don't believe that holding on to Jackson Vanik in any way, shape, or form advances the cause of democracy and human rights in Russia, or rule of law for that matter. What's the causal relationship? There's no causal relationship. On the contrary, we believe that we should work with Congress to do other things and to in parallel, not this kind of linkage, but in parallel to do things that can help to advance rule of law, to advance accountable government, and to strengthen civil society in Russia. For instance, we have proposed to the U.S. Congress to create a new civil society fund for Russia. We've proposed it $50 million in a neutral way, by the way, in terms of new money. That's what I hear in Moscow, that when you talk to real human rights organizations and what they really need, they need that kind of support. That support does not exist from Russian sources. It's a concrete idea. It's being held up by Congress right now. So if you want to do something constructive, that's an area where we should be focusing our attention, not on this weird linkage, like somehow holding Jackson Vanik is going to make Russia more democratic or is going to help us with Syria. It's just there's just no relationship between those things. And if you don't believe me, ask Navalny, because he just put out a piece today with his colleagues, Mr. Nemtsov, Mr. Ryzhkov, and others, that made the argument as emphatic as you could want it. And I think you'll be seeing more and more organizations in Russia trying to explain to us that you're not helping them by holding on to Jackson Vanik. And even in a more sophisticated discussion, if we had time, those that work on rule of law and transparency, Transparency International, for instance, the great people in Moscow that work at that place, they argue very forcefully that WTO constrains bad behavior from their government. And if you're interested in fighting corruption, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything overnight. But our argument is we need to use everything that we can to fight corruption, to help open up society and to constrain bad non-market behavior. We think joining the WTO and being inside the tent as a WTO member that has most favored nation status, PNTR, with Russia, gives us more leverage to be at the table than to be on the outside. Finally, you mentioned Magnitsky. Let me just remind everybody, we took very seriously what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. I personally met with his mother. We met with people that worked with him. I met many times with Bill Browder, who he was working for at the time, and met with Senator Cardin 2 or 3 years ago. And I'm meeting with Senator Cardin, I think, on Wednesday again. We agree with those that say that the gross human rights offenders should not have the opportunity to travel to the United States. We agree. And we agree so much that we've already taken actions. We've taken those actions as the Obama administration. We first, well, it was in parallel, to be fair, it was not exactly a sequence, but we did last August, the president signed a new executive order to give the executive branch more authority to make those kinds of decisions about gross human rights violators. Universally, by the way. This is, for us, we believe this should not be just a Russia-specific thing. This should be a universal principle. And that's the executive order that the president signed. And we've taken that action. By the way, we've taken action beyond the Magnitsky case. So again, we agree with the diagnostics, and we've actually taken action. And we like what we're doing there. In other words, we can have we can have a serious conversation about democracy and human rights in Russia, with Russian government officials, with Russian civil society, and with the U.S. Congress. And we should continue that, and I suspect we will in the questions and answers. But I dare somebody to stand up today and tell me how not repealing, lifting, terminating, whatever the right language is, Jackson Vanik, how that helps the cause of promoting rule of law, democracy, and human rights. We just don't see it that way. And so we want to use other venues, other mechanisms, and other instruments, again, listening to those, after all, on the ground in Russia, not just what we think, but what they think. And that's our answer in terms of that piece of legislation. But I'll stop there, and I'll bet you that's not the last we've heard of that question. So, okay.